Alright guys, how's it going? Apologies for the length of time since my last videos. The main reason for it is I actually bit off more than I could chew. I had intended to do a comprehensive analysis of what is going on at Intel. For those of you who are unaware of it, the company is now also struggling on the financial side of things, not just on the competitive metrics. I actually started working on this video months ago when they had a terrible second quarter. Well, they just had a really bad fourth quarter as well, and things are looking pretty grim for the company. But that video was just a little bit too much for me to handle. However, Intel's financial problems aren't going away anytime soon, and it's a video that I will try to get out at some point this year. For now though, I've decided to concentrate on just one aspect of their seemingly endless problems: the PC. Everything was going perfectly for Intel up until 2017. In fact, things were just a little too perfect for too long. They launched their first quad-core CPU at the end of 2006. That was a Kentsfield QX6700. It was actually two dual-core chips glued together. But this was the real start of what can only be called utter domination for Intel over the next 10 years. As proven by their 2017 launch of another quad-core on their mainstream platform. That was, of course, the 7th gen i7-7700K, which launched right at the beginning of January of that year. Now, they did have 6-core CPUs as far back as 2010, and 8 cores came in 2014, with 10 cores following in 2016, but all of those were reserved for their high-end extreme desktop platform. $1,000 plus CPUs and a platform to match. Intel made a fortune during those 10 years. Every year with, at the time, pretty small CPUs, each generation with minor clock speed or IPC bumps, at of course higher prices. But when you have a cash cow on this kind of level for so long, you really do end up dependent on it. And when things start to go not quite so perfectly, you can end up with a big problem. And as you know, AMD launched Zen in 2017, and they were finally back on near parity in single core terms, with their big advantage being offering 6 and 8 cores on the mainstream platform. Intel responded near immediately. Shocking, right? With their own 6-core mainstream chips with their 8th generation. Then they had 8 cores with their 9th generation, before topping out at 10 cores and their 10th generation. But by then, AMD were miles ahead with 16 cores and 32 threads in the mainstream, while Intel's power draw was heading in the completely wrong direction. It was clear that Intel really needed a new architecture. They couldn't continue just slapping on 2 more cores every year on their backward manufacturing processes. And I'm not even going to bother looking at the joke that was their 11th generation, Rocket Lake. So, Alder Lake was Intel's response, and make no mistake about this, Alder Lake was Intel's real response to Ryzen 5 years later. And the idea of fighting Ryzen by gluing on a bunch of these E cores while maintaining 8 stronger P cores, that was roundly ridiculed at first when we first caught wind of their plans. But it ended up a reasonably effective means of keeping them relevant in performance, if not on power. It was also pretty clear to me by then that in future generations, they would stick with these 8 performance cores while increasing the efficiency core count. These efficiency cores are so small and they sip a lot less power. And with hindsight intact, it was literally all that Intel could have done. It gave them a product that was still very competitive in gaming, thanks to these strong P cores. And the E cores gave them a large boost in the higher multi-threaded applications. The biggest problem for them now though was they were, and well they still are, stuck on this ancient 10nm process, which they first launched in 2018 with Cannon Lake. That was 4 years on 10nm before we saw an actual real desktop chip with Alder Lake. Now I've talked about this before, but these first Cannon Lake chips were pretty disastrous. Dual cores, and the yields were so poor that Intel had to disable the integrated graphics, and it was only sold in China. The telling part here though was the clock speeds, 3.2 GHz, which were even lower than the predecessor Kaby Lake model, which was a 3.4 GHz boost on the older 14nm process. and this was at the same 15 watt TDP. And Meteor Lake still had its IGP as well. Rumours of Intel's 10nm woes had long been floating around, and those were in fact mostly stirred by myself and by Charlie over at Semi-Accurate. But when we saw that pathetic Cannon Lake dual core, that's when we knew that 10nm was in a real mess. It was another 4 years from the launch of Cannon Lake before 10nm clock speeds were anywhere near ready for a decent desktop chip and the 12th series Alder Lake. And today Intel is on the 13th generation, Raptor Lake, and 6GHz boost clocks are now within reach. Intel's 10nm story is really quite bizarre. They started off with laughable 3.2GHz clock speeds on dual cores and ended up with the world's first 6GHz stock CPU with 8 cores. If you just look at it as that alone, they have performed miracles, but it's also important to realise just how long that took. When it came to gaming, Intel always just had this way of staying ahead. Even when AMD had double the cores and were winning by a huge distance in applications. But this all changed in an instant when AMD launched their first X3D processor, the Zen 3 5800X3D. It was only an octa-core chip, and therefore it lost heavily in applications. However, with the introduction of AMD's new V-Cache, a 64MB of L3 cache extension, which is attached to the Zen 3 chiplet, itself coming with 32MB of L3, gave the entire chip an impressive 96MB of L3 cache, as you can see, drastically improving the gaming performance. Larger caches have always been very useful for gaming, but with Zen they appear to have an even larger effect. But Intel struck back pretty fast, with their 13th generation 13900K and later KS, which was around 6% faster than the X3D in gaming. As with Zen 3, AMD launched their non-X3D parts first, with Zen 4, and again they just couldn't quite match the Intel i9s in gaming. Also of note was that the new architecture couldn't quite match the Zen 3 5800X3D either, and that was with the doubled core count and a lot higher clock speeds. Now, I own a 3950X, which is Zen 2, 16 cores, and even though the 5800X3D is clearly superior to my chip in gaming, it's a professional downgrade that I am just not really willing to make for the extra gaming performance. This does annoy me somewhat, and the 16-core 7950X also wasn't really enough of an upgrade for me to justify the whole new platform. That's an awful lot of extra cost, and to be blunt, I wasn't impressed by AMD following Intel's power draw. But it got me thinking, it really has been a while since 16 cores became mainstream, way back with Zen 2. That's 3 years without a core increase. I mean, it's not quite Intel's 10 years with their 4-core shenanigans, but you get my point. AMD's Zen 4 X3D plans didn't really impress me either. I was sure that we would see a 7950 X3D, and obviously we just did, but I wasn't blown away by the fact that only one of the core dies had V-Cache. Of course, AMD claimed that this gives the users the best of both worlds, but the real reason for this move, one cache die, was the cost for marginal benefit. Which makes sense, I guess, if you're an AMD shareholder. However, marginal benefit is still a benefit. And whenever I hear cost reasons, I really hear, we're just not giving you our best. The main reason why performance benefit is marginal with 2 V-Cache dies really comes down to one thing. Games aren't really using 16 cores anywhere near as much as they're using 8 cores. You'll see this on screenshot after screenshot, where one of the dies is running about 50% utilisation, while the other is next to nothing. And here we can see in Hogwarts, with the X3D, the V-Cache die is far more utilised than the non-V-Cache die. And when you've got so much of the gaming workload being done on one chip, it's obvious that having the V-Cache on that chip will result in a large benefit, which won't be seen anywhere near as much on the second chip. But make no mistake about it, the second chip having V-Cache can only be in fact a performance benefit. What annoys me most about this is, the V-Cache die is very small, and it's a 7nm chiplet. according to Paul Alcorn over at Tom's Hardware, it's only around about between 33 and 36 square millimeters. Let's just run that through the silicon cost calculator and we'll get something like this. Die size, let's go with 34. Yield, 100%. If you look at this thing, it is basically just a slab of cash. Yield will be near enough 100%. So the wafer price, 7nm TSMC, let's be generous and call it $10,000 per wafer. I highly doubt AMD is paying anywhere near that, given that they are by far and away TSMC's biggest 7nm customer, because of the game consoles obviously. But let's say 10k just to be on the safe side. And that gives us almost 2,000 dies on a wafer, and a silicon cost of $5.09. So now you know why I'm pissed at AMD saving a very few bucks on this marginal benefit. And yeah, sure, there is obviously on top of that a bonding cost that TSMC do get paid for. And this does require a clean room, so it's not a normal packaging room. But unless this bonding cost is like over 15 bucks per die, they really should have had 2 Vcache dies on their 16 core. So the last couple of things to say about X3D for now is that even with the 16 core 7950 X3D, AMD appears to be sandbagging, or maybe more accurately, they are segmenting the market. Multiple websites did simulated runs, where essentially they turned off the non-Vcache CCD, and some massive performance gains were found in some cases. Factorial was one example, which threw up a ridiculous score. This simulated 8-core chip being 57% faster than Intel's best. Obviously, this simulated CPU is what AMD's 7800 X3D should perform like. And it's not just in Factorial either. Over the 12 game average, I think the simulated 7800 X3D won 2/3 of the benchmarks. And another one to watch out for, this one is probably the most impressive result, is Flight Simulator. The 7950 X3D absolutely destroys the pack in this game, and it is 30% ahead of the 13900 KS, with the gap actually increasing at 1440p to 33%. I think it was the last video where I said that Flight Simulator should be dropped from GPU benchmarks because it's basically a CPU test, but I would not have expected to see this kind of result. This is huge for AMD, by the way, because there are many Flight Simulator players out there who are utterly frustrated with the game's CPU performance. But make no mistake about it, AMD is sandbagging and they are bean counting with Vcache, yet Intel is still getting beaten. Now Raptor Lake hit 6 GHz as discussed, and we know that Intel is soon moving to the Intel 4 process node, and the new Meteor Lake architecture. Finally, their old 10nm will be over and done with, and they will be absolutely delighted about that. However, this may not be true for every product. Everything you've seen in this video so far has been basic fact. Much of the rest of it will be a mix of fact, speculation, leaks, and analysis. I cannot guarantee that everything or even anything I say next will transpire. However, it's been my best shot at it, given what I have to work with. That's my disclaimer. It's been quite a while since I released my Raptor Lake leak video where I leaked Intel's entire lineup a year in advance. And given that these slides I'm about to show you are almost 2 years old, it's pretty safe to show you them now. Starting off with Raptor Lake and Raptor Cove. In that video I said that Intel were claiming world record clock speeds. And as you saw, they did achieve that. And I also mentioned that they would get 2 frequency bins extra, which back then in my video I interpreted that as 5.5 GHz, but they actually hit 5.8 and then 6. But Raptor Lake's old news. At the same time as this, I got some info on Meteor Lake, more specifically their new Redwood Cove core, which is the large performance core we will see in Meteor Lake. You know how old this slide is because Intel were still referring to their rebranded Intel 4 process node as 7nm. Feel free to pause the video and read this whole thing if you want. I'm just going to pick out the most interesting parts of it now. Starting near the bottom in fact. The key features of Redwood Cove. That's a core. is obviously Intel's first 7/4 core processor, targeted to intercept Meteor Lake and Granite Rapids, which is the server product. The next line I found a bit curious though. Power perf improvement to bring 20% core performance. This seems a little bit backwards to me. Shouldn't it be performance power improvement instead of power performance? There's perhaps a hint above as to why they've written it like that. Redwood Cove has embarked on an aggressive goal of achieving significant performance power improvements, bringing up to 20% core performance for servers over the previous generation Sapphire Rapids. I didn't discuss any of this in my video back then, but at the end of it I alluded to a potential issue with Intel's next node. And I did actually discuss my expectations in a Patreon video a few days later. And the reason that I talk so much about 10nm terrible clock speeds at first, with Cannon Lake dual cores, and then only many years later did they have high enough clocks to justify releasing Alder Lake, hopefully that'll be starting to make some sense. Pretty recently, rumours started pointing to Meteor Lake only having 6 performance cores and 16 efficiency cores. Now they did do something similar with Rocket Lake back then when they dropped from, what was it, 8 to 6 or 10 to 8? I can't remember. But possibly even more troubling is that even more recently, the rumours suggest that Intel might just totally cancel Meteor Lake on the desktop in favour of a Raptor Lake refresh. About 9 months ago though, they showed slides with over 20% performance per watt, which sounds a lot better to me than power performance. However, this was at very low clock speeds and voltages. We can see that while Intel 4 continues to be better than the red line, that's Intel 7, compared to this blue line, which is unquestionably better on the voltage frequency curve. The graph only goes just past, what was that, 3.6 GHz? We have seen AMD do this kind of thing in the past as well with their slides, only for the voltage frequency curve to fall off a cliff. If I recall correctly, that's what happened with Zen 1, wasn't it? For me it comes down to this. Even if Meteor Lake does launch with 8 performance cores still, and even with 20% power performance, and even assuming that they can reach 20% IPC gain, in order for Meteor Lake to equal Raptor Lake in performance, they're gonna need about 5 GHz. It would be better in power for around about the same performance, but that is a pretty hard sell to those looking for an upgrade. But regardless of that, I have seen and heard nothing to suggest that Intel are anywhere near 6 GHz, anywhere near 5 GHz, and in fact I have actually heard rumours that they still can't hit 4 GHz on Intel 4. Although, to be honest with you, those rumours may simply be based on this slide. All of this could be wrong. It might just be hearsay. But looking at the language they were using a year and a half ago with those slides that I just showed you, and the complete lack of evidence of high clock speeds, and the rumours of only 6 cores, I think it's obvious what side that the analysis lies on. Just to be clear though, I do believe that Intel 4 is not going to be anywhere near as awful for Intel as 10nm was. And they may even have very competitive server and possibly mobile products too. However, for me it's not looking good on the desktop for the foreseeable future. The core design team appears to have done a really great job with the product, but as I've said many times, you need the design and the process both. Right, back to AMD's side of this story for a bit. Zen has never been the perfect architecture, mostly because its gaming performance often just fell short of Intel's. But now that they've got Vcache, this is now essentially a financial and segmentation decision for AMD. And even with the high-end 7950 X3D, they've taken this reduced cost, save a few bucks route, and they have lost some performance because of it. Some of these performance issues do appear to be scheduling issues, but it's also quite clear that 8 strong gaming cores is more than good enough in the majority of games today, but this will change over the coming years. Zen 5 will be next of course, and for me at least, I have almost no leaked info on that. However, the rumour mills say that it will be 16 cores per chiplet, Another doubling of core count essentially. What I do know is that Zen 5 was always scheduled to be a new core as well, so we should expect to see a pretty decent IPC increase. As I said, it's been 3 years since AMD first launched 16 cores on the desktop. That was the 3950X. And by the time that Zen 5 launches, that'll be at least 4 years. And for me, it is now surely time for 16 core chiplets. So yeah, I believe all of these rumours basically about 16 core chiplets. On top of that, it is crystal clear that Intel intends to compete in core count using E-cores. Alder had 8, Raptor had 16, Meteor again seems to be only 16, but Arrow Lake will probably have 32. Intel are already very competitive in multi-core performance because of their E-cores, and there seems little chance that AMD can continue to compete against 32 E-cores while they are stuck on 8-core chiplets. So yeah, for sure for me, 32 core Ryzen 5 CPUs, or at least 24 cores if they decide to segment it. But let's assume that they do launch Zen 5 with 32 cores. 2 CCDs with 16 cores each instead of the 8 noted here. One of the major drawbacks of chiplets for gaming will be removed simply by doubling the core count, because there will barely be a game out there that requires the usage of this second chiplet. And performance wise, that's more than just doubling the core count, because it's essentially removing this chiplet to chiplet communication penalty as well. We can see over at Anantech's review of the 7950X that the chiplet to chiplet latency is anywhere between 5 and 6 times higher. This shows the 7950X, 16 cores, 32 threads, and we see that so long as the threads are communicating with another thread on the same chiplet, the latency stays in the green zone below 20 nanoseconds. As soon as the core chiplets need to cross communicate, the latency increases by a lot. And this, for me, is probably where the 7950X3D's gaming inconsistencies occur. When there's a spillover into the second chiplet, it causes the whole thing to get bogged down. Which will be accentuated by the fact that the other chiplet doesn't have the V-cache. With Zen 5, this problem will be all but gone. So this will be a big thing for AMD's gaming performance, and they will have decent IPC improvements on top of that. Regarding clock speeds, I've got no idea. But for some reason, TSMC seem able to shrink their processes and continue to gain extra clock speed from those. Meanwhile, Intel seems to go backward on clock speeds before they go forward. And this is actually before V-cache. From a personal point of view, I would very much like to see Zen 5 be a V-cache architecture from the get-go. There seems little technical reason for why it shouldn't be. But as we've seen before, there are unfortunately plenty of marketing and segmentation reasons. What's quite interesting is that for Zen 3, the first chips were launched in November 2020, with the 5800X3D coming quite a bit later. April 2022 actually, when it was first launched I believe, which is roughly 18 months later. Now with Zen 4, the non-X3D chips launched in October, and now the X3Ds have just launched in February. So that gap now is down to 4 months from 18 originally. And cynics might say that AMD's hand was forced because of Raptor Lake. I've done a fair bit of research on the topic recently, and I found a couple of interesting things. Now this might seem obvious, but the Zen 3 chiplets were already prepared for V-cache. As we can see from this AMD slideshow from the ISSCC last year, AMD 3D V-cache support integrated from day one. Even though it would take AMD 18 months to launch the 5800X3D, the support was there from day one of Zen 3's launch. And Zen 3 and the V-cache die were both TSMC 7nm. This might also be part of the reason why it took so long, because of the extra chip prices and competition for 7nm wafers back then. The Zen 4 V-cache is still 7nm, even though the Zen 4 core chiplet is on 5nm now. And obviously we've seen a similar story to that before, with Navi 30 having a 5nm graphics die and 6nm memory cache dies. I read Paul Alcorn's excellent write-up on the subject over at Tom's Hardware, and one thing in particular stood out to me. Obviously, because of the different sizes of manufacturing process, the Zen 4 chiplet is quite a bit smaller than the Zen 3 chiplet. 81 square millimeters for Zen 3 down to 66 square millimeters. Obviously the number of cores remained at 8, and the cache only actually had 4 megabytes because Zen 4 had a doubling of L2. And so you can imagine how everything is basically shrunk inside of this 5nm chiplet. So obviously the Vcache chiplet would also need to be shrunk or modified. And it was indeed shrunk from around 41 square millimeters down to about 34 to 36 square millimeters, we think, for the second generation 7nm still Vcache die. The reason it had to be modified was that in the first version, as Paul notes, both types of TSVs, that's the through silicon vias, connections between the core chiplet and the Vcache, resided in the L3 region of the base chiplet, which we can see here. The TSVs connecting Zen 3 to the Vcache, they were in L3. However, with Zen 4, it now overlaps on the L2 cache, or at least as far as the power TSVs go, that was the case. When I read this, I immediately had a eureka moment, and I was reminded of a very old video that I made years ago, an epic master plan. And here's what I said in that video 5 years ago, which first introduced the topic of AMD having separate core and I/O chiplets.
And if they're now chopping out CPUs, who knows where it ends? As you can see, this L3 takes up quite a lot of die area, and at supposedly quadruple the size, it's going to take up even more, unless they decide to shift half of it or more onto the controller die.
Now, as you just heard, I analysed that AMD would move the L3 cache from the core chiplet onto the I/O die. Neither me nor anyone else had any real clue as to when or even if this kind of die stacking AMD is doing today was really feasible back then. It was all mostly still theory, maybe with some low power samples coming out of TSMC. So to me back then, the only obvious thing was to move the L3 to the I/O die, which with hindsight would have been a performance loss in just too many cases. It's just a little bit too far away compared to stacking the L3 right on top of the core chiplets. Now, I had intended to go even deeper into Vcache in Zen 5 in this video, but I think it's already long enough, and I think that some more research into the subject is required, so that will be my next video instead, coming pretty soon, which is also why I labelled this video part 1. So to finish this one off now, is there any hope for Intel on the desktop at all over the next couple of years? If there is, they will need to be doing a hell of a lot more than simply slapping on a bunch of E-cores. Meteor Lake seems certain to do nothing special whatsoever. That's if we even see it on the desktop. Arrow Lake is probably more of the same. 8 performance cores and even more efficiency cores, 32 in fact. However, recent rumours suggest absolutely huge IPC gains as well. Unless that's true, I cannot fathom how Arrow Lake is even supposed to compete with 32 real performance cores in Zen 5. But that's another thing that I'll analyse in the next video. And to make matters worse for Intel, AMD just go onward and upward. Remember, they already had the means to implement Vcache in Zen 3 18 months before they launched it. Think about how many years ago they must have planned for that. Maybe even 5 years. They're the only company doing this right now. The innovation is relentless. And now they're talking about processing in memory and stacking dies even higher. All this stuff is guaranteed to be coming sooner rather than later. There's very little to stop them stacking Vcache dies 2, 3, 4 high. And on graphics too. And they're even talking about further system integration, stacking DRAM on chips. The end of the motherboard as we know it is probably only 5 years away. Meanwhile, Intel sadly appear instead to be innovating around the problems with their manufacturing. And I can't help but get the feeling that if they're going to get back into the game, much of that will come from TSMC. I'll catch you later, guys.